Clara sat on the porch of her small cabin with a heavy heart, her eyes fixed on the gray mountain peaks as she thought about the life she had left behind. She had moved to this lonely corner of the world because she couldn't face the empty bedrooms and the silent hallways of her old home after the accident that took her little girl. She wanted to be where nobody knew her name and where the cold wind was the only thing that spoke to her. But that evening, the silence was broken by a sound that made her freeze in her seat. A small snow leopard cub was dragging itself across the frozen dirt toward her porch. It wasn't running and it wasn't playing. It was pulling its tiny body along with a kind of pain that Clara recognized instantly because she felt it in her own soul every single day. As the cub got closer, Clara saw the blood. His front paws were raw and bleeding, the skin rubbed away to the red meat from miles of running on sharp rocks. He didn't look like a wild animal in that moment. He looked like a child reaching out for help. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs as the cub reached the first step and simply collapsed. His blue eyes locking onto hers with a look of pure desperation. My amazing friends and family, welcome back to another story. If you're ready to enjoy this heartwarming one, please subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. I truly love seeing your names and places. And don't forget to explore more beautiful stories here on the channel. Now back to the story. Let me take you back to where it all began. Clara had been a medic for a long time, and she had seen people at their worst, but she had never seen anything like this. She ran inside to grab her medical kit, her hands shaking as she pulled out the bandages and the cleaning spray. She knelt in the dirt next to the cub and whispered, "I've got you, little guy. Just stay still." The cub didn't try to bite her or scratch. Instead, he let out a soft, broken whimper and leaned his head against her knee. Clara realized that this cub had traveled a very long way, perhaps 15 miles or more, based on how badly his paws were hurt. He was exhausted and hurting, yet as soon as she finished wrapping his feet in bright red tape, he didn't lay down to rest. He struggled back to his feet and walked a few steps toward the dark mountain pass. He looked back at her and made a crying sound that sent chills down her spine. Clara knew right then that he wasn't there for food or warmth for himself. He was there to lead her somewhere. She grabbed her thick coat and a heavy rope, feeling a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. "Okay," she said to the cub. "I'm coming." They started walking into the darkening hills as the wind began to howl. The walk was much harder than Clara expected. Every step felt like she was fighting the mountain itself. The cub limped ahead, leaving small red prints in the snow from the bandages Clara had just put on him. The climb was steep and the air was thin, making Clara's lungs feel tight and heavy. She watched the cub struggle. He would fall down every few hundred yards because his legs were so tired. But every time he fell, he would shake his head, crawl back up, and keep moving. He didn't have a choice. He was carrying the life of his mother on his tiny shoulders. Clara started talking to him just to keep her own mind from quitting. "You're so brave," she whispered, her breath coming out in white clouds. "I wish I had half your strength, little one." She thought about how she had spent 2 years wanting to give up, wanting to just let the cold take her. But here was this tiny creature, bleeding and broken, refusing to stop. It made her feel ashamed of her own darkness. They reached a narrow ledge where the path was barely wide enough for a person to stand. The wind was trying to push Clara off the edge, but the cub didn't seem to care. He was focused on a spot further up. Suddenly, the cub stopped and began to dig at a pile of rocks. He wasn't digging for a bone or a toy. He was digging toward a dark crack in the cliff. Clara hurried over and looked down. Her heart stopped. Deep in the crevice, pinned under a massive slab of stone that must have fallen during the last storm, was a large female leopard. She was the mother. She was trapped in a way that meant she could never get out on her own. She was pinned by her back legs, her body twisted and thin. She looked like she had been there for days. When the mother saw Clara, she didn't growl. She didn't show her teeth. She just let out a long, tired sigh and closed her eyes for a second, as if she was finally letting go because she knew her baby had brought someone. Clara felt a sob rise in her throat. She saw herself in that mother leopard. She saw what it felt like to be pinned down by something too heavy to move. She saw the desperation of a mother who was about to leave her child alone in a cold world. "No," Clara said, her voice becoming strong and loud. "I'm not letting this happen. Not again." She grabbed her rope and started looking for a way down. The cub stood right at the edge of the hole, his little bandaged paws treading the dirt, watching Clara with eyes that seemed to be begging her to hurry. Clara knew she was only one woman against a rock that weighed hundreds of pounds. She knew she might get crushed. She knew she might get bitten. But for the first time in 2 years, Clara didn't care about her own safety. She only cared about the heartbeat waiting for her at the bottom of that hole. She tied her rope to a solid rock at the top and began to lower herself down into the dark. Clara slid down the rope, her boots scraping against the cold stone walls of the hole. When she reached the bottom, the space was so small that she could feel the heat coming off the mother leopard's body. The smell was thick with dirt and the scent of an animal that had been suffering for days. Clara stayed very still, her heart thumping in her ears like a drum. She was inches away from the most dangerous hunter in these mountains, and she didn't have a weapon. But as she looked into the mother leopard's eyes, she didn't see a killer. She saw a mother who was exhausted from fighting. The big cat's breathing was shallow and fast. Clara reached out a hand, moving slowly like she was approaching a frightened soldier on the battlefield. "I'm here to help, girl," she said, her voice soft and steady. "I'm not going to hurt you." The leopard let out a weak sound, a soft rattle in her throat, and she rested her heavy chin on the dirt. She was giving up her last bit of strength because she knew she couldn't fight anymore. Clara looked at the massive slab of rock pinning the leopard's hind legs. It was wedged tight. Because the crevice was so narrow, Clara couldn't get a good angle to lift it. She looked up and saw the cub peering over the edge, his little head silhouetted against the dark sky. He made a small whimper, and Clara knew she had to move. She found a long, sturdy piece of wood that had fallen into the crack and jammed it under the edge of the stone. She used her shoulder as a pivot and pushed. The rock didn't move. She tried again, putting every bit of weight she had into the lever. Her muscles started to shake and sweat began to sting her eyes, even in the freezing cold. "Come on," she hissed through her teeth. "Move." She thought about the little cub running 15 miles on those bleeding paws. He hadn't quit, and she wasn't going to quit either. She remembered the day of the accident, how she had reached into the wreckage of the car, trying to pull her own daughter free. She remembered the feeling of being too weak, of the metal being too heavy. That memory turned into a white-hot fire in her belly. She wasn't going to let the mountain win this time. She took a deep breath, wrapped her arms around the wooden lever, and screamed as she gave it one final, desperate heave. The rock groaned and shifted an inch. It was just enough. The mother leopard felt the pressure change and, with a sudden burst of primal energy, she dragged her back legs out from under the stone. The effort took everything she had left, and she collapsed into the dirt, panting. Clara fell back against the wall of the hole, her lungs burning and her hands trembling. For a few minutes they just sat there together in the dark, a broken woman and a broken cat. The cub at the top started to wail, a high-pitched sound of worry. The mother leopard lifted her head and let out a soft call back to him. Clara knew they weren't safe yet. The mother was free, but she was too weak to climb out on her own. Clara stood up and began to loop her rope under the leopard's chest, making a harness like she used to do for injured soldiers. It was a slow, painful process. Every time Clara touched her, the leopard's skin would twitch, but she never once snapped. When the harness was ready, Clara climbed back up the rope to the surface. She stood on the ledge and looked at the cub. "Okay, little man," she said. "It's time to bring her home." Clara wrapped the rope around a large rock horn and began to pull. Because the mother leopard was so heavy, every inch was a battle. Clara's gloves tore, and the rope began to bite into her skin, but she didn't stop. She pulled until her vision went blurry. She pulled until she felt like her heart was going to burst. And then, finally, a large silver-gray paw reached over the edge of the hole. Then another. The mother leopard scrambled onto the flat ground and let out a long, shaky breath. The cub didn't wait. He rushed to his mother, burying his face in her thick fur and purring so loudly it sounded like a small engine. The mother licked him over and over, her tongue rough and loving. Clara collapsed onto the snow a few feet away, her eyes wet with tears. She watched them for a long time, the way they clung to each other in the middle of the wasteland. She realized that the cub had done the impossible. He had found the one person in these mountains who knew what it was like to lose everything, and he had forced her to care again. The mother leopard slowly stood up on her injured legs. She looked at Clara with a deep, knowing gaze. She didn't run away. Instead, she limped over to where Clara was sitting and nudged Clara's hand with her cold, wet nose. It was a gesture so human it made Clara sob out loud. Then, the two leopards turned and began to walk slowly up the ridge, disappearing into the mist. Clara sat there in the silence, but for the first time in 2 years, the silence didn't feel lonely. Felt like peace. She looked down at her hands, covered in dirt and blood, and she knew she was ready. She was ready to go back down the mountain. She was ready to face her life. She stood up, gathered her rope, and started the long walk back to her cabin, following the faint red trail of the cub's bandages in the snow. She knew she would never be the same again. The little messenger with the bleeding paws had led her to a rescue, but the life he had saved was hers. Clara woke up the next morning and the cabin felt different. The air was still freezing, but the walls didn't feel like a prison anymore. She looked at her hands, which were swollen and bruised from the ropes, and she felt a strange sense of pride. For the first time in 2 years, she didn't wake up wishing she hadn't. She began to pack her things into old cardboard boxes. She didn't have much, just some clothes, a few books, and her daughter's favorite stuffed rabbit that she had kept tucked under her pillow. As she touched the soft fur of the toy, she didn't pull away from the pain. Instead, she held it close and let herself cry. She wasn't crying because she was lost. She was crying because she was finally found. She carried the boxes to her truck, the engine groaning as it came to life in the cold air. She took one last look at the mountain peaks. Somewhere up there, a mother was resting with her cub, and that thought gave Clara the strength to put the truck in gear. The drive down the mountain was slow. The road was narrow and winding, and every turn felt like she was leaving a piece of her grief behind. She thought about her sister, Maria, and how long it had been since she had answered any of her letters. She felt a pang of guilt, but she pushed it down. She wasn't that person anymore. By the time the trees started to get thicker and the air grew warmer, Clara reached the small town where she had grown up. The streets looked the same, but they felt smaller somehow. She drove straight to Maria's house. It was a modest place with a porch swing and a garden that was just starting to bloom. Clara sat in the truck for a long time, her hands gripping the steering wheel. She was terrified. What if they didn't want her back? What if she had stayed away too long? She reached into her pocket and felt the scrap of red bandage she had picked up from her porch. She remembered the cub's eyes. If that little animal could run 15 miles on raw paws to save his family, she could walk 20 feet to hers. She opened the truck door and stepped out. The gravel crunched under her boots. Just as she reached the bottom step of the porch, the front door opened. Maria stood there holding a bag of groceries. When she saw Clara, the bag slipped from her hands, and an apple rolled across the wooden floor. "Clara?" Maria whispered, her voice trembling. Clara couldn't even speak. She just nodded as the tears started to fall. Maria flew down the steps and threw her arms around Clara, holding her so tight it hurt. "You're home," Maria sobbed. "Oh, thank God, you're finally home." They sat in the kitchen for hours. Maria made tea, the real kind with honey and lemon, and Clara told her everything. She didn't leave out the dark parts. She told her about the days she spent staring at the wall, wishing for the end. And then she told her about the cub. She described the way his blue eyes looked and how the blood on the snow looked like rubies. Maria listened without saying a word, her hand resting on Clara's arm. When Clara got to the part about the mother leopard leaning her head against her shoulder, Maria started to cry. "He knew," Maria said softly. "That cub knew you were a mother too. He knew you wouldn't let him down." The conversation shifted to the daughter Clara had lost. For the first time, Clara talked about the accident without her voice disappearing. She talked about the little girl's laugh and how much she loved to draw. It was like a dam had broken inside her, and all the love she had been hiding turned into stories instead of silence. As the weeks went by, Clara moved into the spare room at Maria's house. She started helping out at a local animal shelter, cleaning cages and feeding the strays. She liked being around the animals. They didn't ask her questions, and they didn't judge her for her past. One afternoon, a man brought in a dog that had been hit by a car. The dog was terrified and snapping at everyone. The other workers were afraid to get close, but Clara walked right up to the kennel. She sat on the floor and started to hum a low, soft tune, the same one she had used for the mother leopard in the dark crevice. Within minutes, the dog stopped growling and laid its head on its paws, watching her. Clara knew then what she was meant to do. She wasn't just a medic for soldiers. She was meant to be a voice for the ones who couldn't ask for help. She decided to go back to school to get her veterinary license. It was hard work, and she was much older than the other students, but she didn't care. She had a mission now. A year later, Clara was working in her own small clinic. It wasn't fancy, but it was full of life. People brought her their sick cats, their hurt dogs, and even the occasional wild bird with a broken wing. She treated every single one with the same care she had given that snow leopard cub. One morning, she opened a package that had been left at her door. There was no name on it, just a postmark from the mountain town where she used to live. Inside was a framed photograph taken by a trail camera. It was a picture of a full-grown snow leopard and a young male standing on a high ridge. The male had a small, faint scar on his front paw, shaped almost like a heart. Clara touched the photo and smiled. She knew they were okay. She knew they were out there, living their lives because of a night when trust was stronger than fear. She hung the picture on the wall of her clinic, right where she could see it every day. Clara finally felt like a whole person again. The hole in her chest hadn't disappeared, but it was filled with the memories of the lives she had saved and the love she had found again. She realized that grief is a mountain you have to climb, and sometimes you need a little help to find the path. She had been a ghost in a stone cabin, but a tiny messenger with bleeding paws had led her back to the light. She was home, she was loved, and she was finally at peace. As the sun set over the town, Clara closed up her clinic and walked to her truck. She looked up at the moon, thinking about the leopards far away. She whispered a quiet thank you to the wind, knowing that somewhere out there, the cub was looking at the same moon, forever connected to the woman who heard his cry in the dark. Thank you to my amazing family for staying with me until the end of this story. Your support means the world to me. If you enjoyed this journey, I just know you'll love what comes next. I've prepared something even more exciting and surprising that I can't wait to share with you. Just click on the end card appearing on your screen right now to watch the next one.